Right, let's kick on then with managing end-of-lease assets. Our expert guides in the session are Padraig Conneely, Chief Technical Officer, LCI, James Nohilly, Senior Vice President, Milestone Aviation, Marc Schechter, Director, ITE Management and MD, Thora Capital, Brad Scheen, of course, Director and Founder, International Aviation Marketing. I'm going to start by asking each of our speakers to share their opening thoughts over a couple of minutes before we move on to a more detailed look at managing end-of-lease assets. Brad, let's start with you.
Sure. So we announced at HAI this year, or VAI, whatever they call it now, that we've launched a business called Schechter Heli Finance. That business is really focused on, one of the key focuses on that business is this topic. So we've built a business where we are approaching lessors about acquiring end-of-lease assets that are non-core to their future requirements. So our model essentially is that we'll come in, start discussing the acquisition of a what I call a non-core helicopter to their business, roughly 12 to 18 months before the asset is returned. So we essentially will then step in, sign a purchase agreement with the client, and as the asset comes off, we will then actually take the redelivery of the helicopter, which really alleviates that expense and that headache of returning some of these assets that our certain operators had for a significant period of time. So we believe that it's a very efficient solution to help lessors out with the end-of-life assets, or end-of-lease assets, not life.
A succinct summary, thank you. Padraig, please, give us your view.
Yeah, since this time last year, we've had a very busy 12 months. We've been busy on the new delivery front, right up to this week. The transitions have been reducing, but I think that's a reflection on where the market is at now, and as as operators and end users are trying to secure those assets. But it's been busy from us from a technical point of view in terms of the deliveries, and as I said, less transitions. But it's been a good 12 months.
Okay, Marc.
So at Thora, we've financed over 50 aircraft over the last half decade or so. Our Fund 1, which had about 35 aircraft, has been in the mature phase for the last couple of years. And we've been selling or releasing those assets. We've now sold about 20 aircraft from that Fund 1, and we've released or otherwise redeployed 15 of those aircraft. So we've had a busy couple of years moving 35 aircraft from their initial homes at Thora to new homes.
Yeah, okay, thank you. James.
Yeah, so obviously Milestone Aviation is approaching 15 years of age now, which is longer than any lease that we've written so far. So we
Congratulations.
have quite a bit of experience of managing end-of-lease assets. As a long-term operating lessor, our primary goal in managing an end-of-lease asset is to put the asset on another lease, which isn't necessarily, say, a traditional financing model, but we're long-term investors in the assets. That said, we have a portfolio of just over 320 assets today, not a materially different number than when we were most recently acquired by AirCap, but a different looking portfolio and a different shape of portfolio. We transition in one form or another 50 to 60 assets every year. That includes new deliveries, buying new aircraft. We have over 20 new deliveries planned in the next 12 months, selling portfolios of aircraft, which we have done successfully over the last couple of years, and managing certain aircraft out of the portfolio, either through selling those assets in single sales to customers, or working with third parties to part out the aircraft, which we've done quite a bit of as well. So we've had a very busy few years. I suppose there's a change in the environment over the last while. It's meant that we're not managing aircraft on the ground. We have less transitions, more extensions, more release, but still a huge amount of activity going on, and a huge amount of activity on the new aircraft side as well.
Thank you. Now, I was doing some research on this topic last night in the Royal Oak Public House, as it happens, and I was talking to an appraiser, no names, no pack drill, who cheekily suggested that perhaps end-of-lease asset management doesn't draw the consideration, or rather doesn't always draw the consideration that's due. Brad, is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's one of those things that it can be extremely costly. It can be extremely costly to both the operator and the lessor. You've got an asset. I mean, I guess it goes back to the intrinsic. You know, if you lease a car, you treat the car one way. If you own the car, you treat the car another way. So it's the idea that you've got that risk of the return. You've got an operator that may not view, you know, a long-term asset as theirs, and therefore they may treat it a little differently. So I think it gets to a point where, yeah, you need to be concerned because the financial impact to your business could be significant, especially when you're talking 50 to 60 assets returned. That could be big numbers. You got $1 million problem 60 times over. That's quite a big problem.
James, what's your view on that?
I think, like, ultimately, in terms of operating lease, in terms of our model, the vast majority of the cash flows, the vast majority of value in any individual transaction is the residual value of the asset at the end of the lease.
Right.
And that can never be forgotten and should never be forgotten.
Yeah.
I fully agree that it's not appreciated in a lot of places. People pick a number off a depreciation chart and say, I'm going to get back that value at the end of the lease. You might and you might not. So managing that redelivery process, understanding the return conditions, understanding how you're going to see the asset, and making sure that that asset is marketable to other users of the same type within the same industry or across industries is hugely important, and I think it is undervalued.
Padraig, it was even suggested to me that perhaps the end-of-lease conditions might be, how shall we say, dare we say, fudged in order to ease the signing at the beginning of the lease. Is that fair? Do you see that happening?
No, I think at the beginning of the lease, you are planning, as Brad said, you have to plan for that, you know, not just that first lessee, but also, you know, the remarketability, as James has alluded to. I mean,
yeah.
So you have to plan for whether that's getting that, you know, flexibility from a remarketing perspective and having, you know, additional, you know, fixed provisions for certain kids already in, you know, in that specification. It is a whole, you know, in terms of planning, you have to not look just at the first lease, but at the follow-on lease. And then in terms of redelivery, you know, you have complicating factors in there. You could be, you know, transitioning, you know, between jurisdictions, which, you know, just increases that complexity in terms of maybe additional modifications that follow-on lessee might require, STCs, getting that import, you know, inspections done, for example, coming from FAA to EASA. I mean, that can be, you know, that can be a really complex and a really difficult process. So there are a lot of factors in there that you have to, you know, you have to try and plan for. I mean, look, at the end of the day, it's all about, you know, risk mitigation, and it's how you manage those risks.
Okay. We'll come back to that. Yeah, I just want to come to
Mike,
Marc. Yeah.
There's no way that we would fudge delivery a return condition in a lease to get a lease. Yeah. And I can't imagine, frankly, that any responsible lessor would do that.
Have you ever seen it elsewhere?
That a return condition was eased for a commercial purpose? Frankly, no.
I think the reality is that helicopter leasing is a relatively new concept compared to airline leasing, right? So I think one of the things that I know when Milestone first started in the business, they learned a lot of tough lessons, that they did not have the correct return conditions, that aircraft were coming back, people could take advantages of gaps in those agreements. So I think that was happening. I think that the industry had, you know, the lessors had to really work and define and continuously refine their return conditions, because it is so fundamental.
I'm detecting audience reaction. Would anyone like to have a view on that? No? Not yet. Not yet. Okay, fair enough. All right. So, what about the ingredients of a successful end of lease? What's the recipe for making it work? Brad?
Listen, I think management of leases by lessors and customer connection is imperative. You know, you've got to be planning, you you've got to be planning your lease return, at least a year out, if not more, just to make sure that all the variables are taken care of. PBH transfers happen properly. If you've got alternate serial numbers on there, there's just so many factors, like Padraig said, that play into it. That it's communication and having that partnership with your client working together to make sure it's a smooth transition.
Padraig, what's in your recipe?
Yeah, I mean, it's all about that communication. It's close collaboration with the lessee, and having that, you're inspecting, you're auditing that helicopter throughout the lease cycle, so you shouldn't be getting any surprises at lease end, and you're starting that process, the redelivery process, from at least 6 months out.
Yeah.
So once you have that communication and that collaboration, that enables your planning. And then, going along with that, you have to, on the documentation side, on the legal side, you've got factors to consider, like, tax issues, again, if you're going between jurisdictions. You've got, down to the detail of, transport, road permits, there's quite a lot that goes into the whole planning in terms of that transition.
Marc Schechter, what's on your to-do list when you approach this topic?
So key for us is starting early.
Sorry?
Starting early.
Oh, yeah.
So we're a small team at Thora, so we are making rather liberal use of outside experts, be it marketing experts, technical experts, and we need to bring those people into the project with significant advanced timing to be able to align our objectives with the realities of the market. So we're often starting a discussion on what we will do in a potential return or release scenario a year before the end of the lease. And our goal generally is at 90 days to be completely set on what our outcome is going to be. If it's going to be a return, how we're going to effectuate the return. If it's a release, we're going to have the release terms and conditions set with the lessee. Look, it doesn't always work out that way. There are certainly scenarios where we're still negotiating, or just the reality for the lessee is that the timeline has to be more condensed. But getting out ahead of the situation is always beneficial.
Okay. James, when is a good time to start these conversations?
I think I'd agree with the panelists that ultimately we start the conversations in around a year out from the redelivery. I think that you asked it originally, what's the sign of a successful redelivery? A successful redelivery is a marketable asset and being able to shake hands with operator A as you walk out the door and think of them as a repeat customer. There's two sides to a redelivery. It's not just about getting the asset out, but it's the continuing relationship with the customer that's there. And key to all that is communication, is having the early identification of issues that might come up, understanding what the return conditions are, because they have evolved over time. We're taking back aircraft now we might have leased 12 years ago, 13 years ago, and have gone through extensions since. Those return conditions don't look like leases we wrote 5 years ago. There have been learnings in the interim, without question. It's not to say they were bad, but oftentimes they were less specific than what we would have liked. And working with lessees to make sure that you have a marketable product at the end, but that customer knows that you've treated them fairly, you've gone through the process, and leasing is not the bogeyman that someone's going to come and get me and stick me for $500,000 at the end of this. That they understand there's a process they can go through to mitigate risk on their side and to walk that process through with them.
Thank you. Brad, anything else to add about what success looks like in terms of this topic?
I think, we're especially when you get to the aging products like a 76 or a Dolphin or in some ways case of Bell 412. Some of these products, the return conditions really aren't an efficient solution. There's a time and a place where the asset needs to move on. The chances are, like I said, the lessor will probably want to move on from it. So I think one of the things that is also behooves the industry is to say, okay, I've got an S76. It may take $1 million for me to go put that back into a returnable condition, but that's the point where the lessor and the operator and potentially an organization like myself really got to be disciplined and go in and say, okay, it's not efficient. Let's go and get a game plan. Either move the aircraft on, tear it down, go make some other decisions that are efficient and not not cost a bunch of capital that we don't need to spend.
Okay. So we've talked about the ingredients for a successful recipe for end-of-lease management. Is it helpful to think of what such a agreement should specify? What needs to be specified in an end-of-lease agreement? Is there anything to add on that? We've talked about it already, I know. Anyone want anything to add?
You mean in terms of the actual specific return conditions? Yeah, I mean, you're going to, you know, without kind of getting into the detail, but you're going to be specifying in terms, you may want to specify a minimum number of hours of flight hours remaining. You need to go on you know, engines, on LCFs, you know, in terms of what inspections, you know, the helicopter will come out of, because the way it's going now, you know, you really, you know, the ideal scenario is you want to be taking those helicopters back out of, you know, heavy checks. When I say heavy checks, be that a 4-year, a 12 or 1600 hour, you know, you need to be taking the helicopters back out of a comprehensive check. You also, you know, there's also the conversation going on, you know, do you, you know, return all your helicopters out of the operator? You know, they'll do all of the return maintenance versus third-party MROs, which gives you that bit of independence. So that's a conversation that's happening more and more right now. And that also, you know, brings its complications with it as well. So yeah, there are quite a lot of detail within those return conditions that you want to, because again, it's back to back. So if you're going to be remarketing a helicopter, you're remarketing that on a certain set of conditions on the other side. So it has to be back to back. You know, the scenario you don't want to end up with is, you know, you're in no man's land. You know, you've taken it back, you know, before you've placed it. Then you've got someone else coming to do their own inspection, and it's, you know, that's not really a place you want to be. So, you know, you have to get that back to back, so and match those conditions.
Marc or James, anything to add to that?
I would say that the more detailed the return conditions are in the lease, the better it is for both the lessee and the lessor. Yeah. It leaves often, so I said earlier that a lessor would be remiss to fudge return conditions in a lease. There are, and that's how I feel, and I think that's how everyone here would agree they feel. But there are certainly, as James suggested, leases kind of floating in the ether that have been originated many years ago, perhaps by other parties, that end up in our
so you inherit them, as it were,
that have return conditions that are less than ideal.
Am I detecting frustration there?
Well, they're challenging to work with for both the lessor and the lessee to effectuate a return that both parties are agreeable to. The more detailed those return conditions are in the lease, the easier it is to effectuate the return that leaves both parties feeling pleased.
James Nohilly, Milestone Aviation. Do inherited leases make you frustrated?
At times, but to be honest, that's an evaluation you make when you look at buying that lease. Kieran Seymour delivering an asset today from a customer, which is an aircraft I bought that was on lease a few years ago. Yeah. It's an ongoing customer of ours, a customer we have other leases with. This one stands out like a sore thumb. It's different return conditions. And that's challenging in that you have a process with that lessee to return an aircraft under Milestone return conditions. These don't look like Milestone return conditions. So again, down to communication, down to going back and saying, okay, how are we going to do this? Is it different? We, Milestone, want a similar product out the back end. So how do we structure that to work between us? So it's an additional element to manage, but it's not insurmountable. And I think largely, as the industry has matured, we're largely converging around a set of return conditions that are broadly standard across the industry with nuances. And I don't see return conditions being fudged as a commercial transaction, but there are different return conditions for different lessees, like nuances that
not radically different then?
Not dramatically different, but maybe you've got more optionality or a higher bar with certain people, or that certain costs are shared in one which might not be shared in another depending on where you go. Things like that can happen, but that's done because you recognize benefits for the lessor in having a certain thing, and the lessee can give a reasoned argument as to why that's an out of sync cost for them, and you can.
Brad, are you seeing conditions converge?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think it's fairly standard that there are conditions, and we're so far I think we've been really focused on the nice returns. What we're forgetting is the not so nice returns when you come into a situation where a true repossession has to happen, or you've got a client that has their contract's been terminated and therefore they need to find a solution to return the aircraft. I think that's where it becomes imperative, and the return conditions are that much more important than what you face early on. I mean, I'm sure you guys have seen that with your situations.
Yeah, okay. So this is your opportunity to quiz our audience, to quiz our panel about end-of-lease management. Please ask a question on Slido. I see we've got one already. Or raise your hand and someone will come with a microphone. Does anyone want to share lessons they've learnt from not nice returns? What lessons that experience taught them, apart from Brad, who mentioned the topic? Would any of you like to share what you've learnt? In any general sense, without naming any company.
So, look, we've had a handful of returns that have been, let's say, less than nice. And the worst ones, where you have, essentially a hostile lessee, you're at the whim of in sense, you've lost control in a significant way potentially. The way you are able to back up that loss of control is with good technical support, good legal support. You need to have a very effective team.
Yeah.
And the best situation that you can put yourself in is to have that team lined up in advance. And I'm sure we all have experts that we work with in all of the jurisdictions that we're leasing aircraft to, that we are prepared, that we have kind of in the Rolodex the call if something goes wrong. And that's incredibly important to make a bad situation potentially better.
Padraig, what's your planning for when it goes bad?
Yeah, I think just to follow up on that first question, I think, first of all, if you're not learning lessons and applying them, then, there's something wrong. You have to be, taking the military principle of learn lessons, and it's important that that you're not repeating the same mistakes on redeliveries. And we've had, a few, not many, thankfully, but a few examples. And some of those points, some of those learnings would be, like I said earlier, having the lessee part of the follow-on lessee part of that conversation, because that's going to mitigate the risk. It's getting on the ground with the current lessee in terms of that heavy maintenance and planning for it. Again, varies slightly from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, operator to operator, but you need to know your operator. You need to be, when those panels are coming off and you're on the ground, you need to have your eyes on the ground to make sure that those issues are, that you can see. You're not going to always get 100%, but you're going to get, 99% of the issues there and deal with them there and then, and that it's not something that's going to, so there are lessons that we've learned from transitions, that we have applied.
James at Milestone Aviation, anything to add before we move on to our first question from the audience?
No, I fully agree with the panel. I think there's been a lot of learnings. And look, there's been some bad redeliveries or some less than optimal redeliveries.
Yeah.
In difficult situations, maybe with repossession is a different ballpark altogether. But each time we've learned something, we've built that into the return conditions. I can think of, Milestone's 15 years old. I'm with Milestone now 12 years. And the first two aircraft we ever redelivered from one of our obviously early customers and still a customer at this stage, it had dragged on for a few weeks. There was some discussions around the return conditions. There was unhappiness on both sides through a lack of early communication. And we got a phone call one day saying, your aircraft have been loaded on a freighter. They land in Heathrow in 4 hours. Please pick them up. We've moved on from there. They're still a customer, but there's lots of learnings along the way.
Yeah, and would it be fair to say that we're seeing fewer and fewer of these bad returns, poor return incidents, as the industry becomes more educated? Would that be fair?
I mean, like they said yesterday, the market is much more stable than it was.
Yeah.
If you get back into the scenario of 2015, 2016, 2017, it was just a tough time for everyone, you know.
Yeah.
So I think today it's obviously much more stable, and a lot of leases are getting extended. People are keeping the assets longer, and everything else. So I think it's that stability in the industry which you're seeing the reason that it is a successful. If times change, it goes back. It goes back to a difficult conversation when you have some returns that may not go well.
Okay, unless anyone's got anything else to add, we'll move to this question. Apart from the lease rate, do you see significant differences between first, second and third leases, term deposit financing or return conditions? Let's start off with Marc on that, please.
So most of our aircraft on their first lease are already mid-life aircraft. So in our follow-on leases at Thora, we don't see any significant change in terms.
Yeah.
That is probably different for those that are working with newer assets on the first lease, but no, we don't see a difference.
Okay. Padraig.
Look, fundamentally, the same for us. The same principle will apply. If it's a second or third lease, you may get situations where there's some negotiation around PBH and what that PBH would look like. Whether it's a full components plan, for example, whether it's an essential components plan. Some of those assets, particularly if they're inherited, you might be having conversations around a betterment and detriment as opposed to a PBH. So they're the kind of things that, as you get into your older leases, those conversations start to happen a little bit more than you would obviously have on your first lease or even your second lease.
Yeah. James, is that a picture you recognise?
Yeah, I don't see a material difference. I think there's certain things, nuances, but fundamentally they're very similar for us and from our perspective. I think early on in helicopter leasing days, there was this idea of a BD or a midlife return condition. I think the midlife has largely gone out because it's much more of a fixed wing concept than a helicopter concept. It doesn't tend to align to what we do. So there's things like that where you might see in older leases, but generally no second, third leases. They're still young assets in their very long useful life.
Yeah. Brad, any take on this?
Yeah, I think I agree with. In some cases, it's probably type specific, but generally, I agree. It's the terms and conditions stay relatively the same, especially if it's with the same operator. If it changes operators, obviously, then you've got significant changes or the opportunity for significant changes. But yeah, everything will relatively stay the same.
Is anyone seeing fewer end-of-lease contracts in the sense of primary mission lives extending? Is that a fair observation?
Yes, I think right now it is, and I think there are a number of factors involved in that. One, there's longer lead times from the OEMs for new helicopters. Yeah. That's a big factor. But you also have, as James alluded to earlier, those aircraft that we have that are on, those workhorses that are out there, be it oil and gas, be it EMS, they're still relevant. They're still relevant from a technical point of view, from a performance point of view, from a commercial point of view, obviously. And I think, Brad, the panel you were on yesterday, you kind of touched on it. It comes down to really, then it's those technological advances and, if there's going to be upgrades or, that's really what drives it. This conversation that we're having, it all points to, at the end of the day, I think, the resilience of helicopters, and that's, and that's what we're seeing right through, in terms of being able to, leave those assets on longer leases, getting to perform those missions. But there are factors there that are I think, feeding into those extensions.
Yeah.
I think
James,
the operating lease product and the operating lessors involved, we're all of a broadly similar age. The vast majority of our aircraft are on their primary missions. We own 77 S-92s tonight. 59 of them are in offshore transport. 17 of them are flying search and rescue missions, and we've got one helicopter in firefighting. So it's a slightly more than 1% of the S-92s are in a secondary mission right now. So we're predominantly a primary mission lessor. Our aircraft, on average, are 7.5 years old. The average S-92, half of the S-92 fleet was built between 2010 and 2015. They're 10 to 15 years old. There's an awful lot of S-92s out there that are younger than super mediums in the market. So, primary missions are still with us for a long time and will be for a long time. Yeah. I do see them extending out, and I do see them getting longer than some of the rhetoric.
Offshore contracts then are not specifying 10 years necessarily. They're adding a bit to it. Is that right?
10 years is an absolute anomaly. It's not a thing.
Okay. Yeah. Any?
No, he's absolutely right. 10 years not, unless it's a country specific tip.
Well, I was going to say, is that, James, the situation worldwide or in particular markets?
You can't bring an aircraft older than 5 years into Thailand. You have challenges with ONGC contracts with aircraft older than 7 years. There's nuances everywhere, but in the vast majority of markets, there are no restrictions in the North Sea. There are no restrictions in Brazil. There are no restrictions in Australia. There are no restrictions in Malaysia. I could go through it. 85-90% of the jurisdictions don't have an issue. Certain oil companies have a preference, and hopefully they'll learn that they pay for preferences.
Marc, anything to add?
Not on this question.
No. Padraig?
No, just to James' point. I mean, that's why you can see, you might see a trend, in that where, the newer 139s, for example, are going to the to those growth areas, and they're going to the newer contracts, if you like. But you're still seeing on those older contracts where you're getting, for example, short-nose 139s going back to work, but on the older contracts. So those type of nuances are out there, and that's what we're seeing.
Yeah. We're running out of time, but we will just have a quick answer on this. How do you plan for lease ends for specifically equipped aircraft? Anyone got any observations on that?
Shouldn't have bought in the first place.
So about 2/3 of Thora's fleet has been EMS configured aircraft.
Yeah.
And we have made a concerted effort in our remarketing to find new homes for those aircraft in that mission configuration.
Yeah.
On the basis that there would be a degradation of value for the lessor if we had to reconfigure that aircraft.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
We've done a couple of conversions from oil and gas to EMS. I'm sure you guys have probably seen something similar. I've seen some VIP to EMS, for example. I think, Brad, actually that's something you touched on yesterday. So there have been some examples of that. And again, having the ability to do that, I think is also it's a differentiator, because in some cases it's for us it's worked out very well.
James, last word, parting thought?
Try not to get extremely specifically configured assets.
Yeah. It's like asking directions somewhere, well, you shouldn't start from here.
It's one of those situations where you better got paid for the aircraft, right? If you're in a role like this, where it's it's like putting a sonar on a commercial helicopter. You better get paid for that aircraft, that 10-year contract, or you made a mistake.
Thank you so much for sharing those views. We've got to push it into the hangar there. My thanks to Padraig Conneely from LCI, James Nohilly from Milestone Aviation, Marc Schechter, Thora Capital, and of course Brad Scheen from International Aviation Marketing. Thank you.